Before I start, I would like to add that this is still a work in progress because I'm still working on my thesis. So, I'll begin now. In Piotr Piotrowski's book, In the Shadow of Yalta, writing about the 1960s, he mentions that Polish and Czechoslovak artists did not work in mutual isolation and came into contact during the 1962 Argumenty exhibition in Warsaw. And I was thinking, what about other possible circumstances in which Polish and Czechoslovak artists, art critics, theoreticians, and art historians met and cooperated? So if we can think of a map or many maps of unofficial personal transnational artistic contacts in the Eastern Bloc, like perhaps the East Art map by Irvin, what would be the map of the contacts happening through institutions, and what are the relations between? Do they overlap in any way? When it comes to the institutional contacts in the Cold War era, the formal basis for them was international agreements, where two countries agreed on cooperating on various fields of culture. Poland and Czechoslovakia signed such an agreement in 1947 and began an exhibition exchange that lasted through the whole period of socialism. Piotrowski proposed horizontal art history, and using this concept, he linked artistic tendencies taking place in various places of the region of East Central Europe. So similarly, it is possible to draw links between art institutions in different countries of the bloc, which were cooperating with each other. Over the course of my PhD studies, I have found materials about around 300 exhibitions of Polish art in Czechoslovakia in the post-war period, from 1945 to 1992. They took place in various places, were organized by various institutions, depending on the year they took place in. They had different political underpinning, and also they varied in terms of content. Therefore, it is quite difficult to make any general statements about these exhibitions. One thing that has become visible to me after analyzing multiple case studies is that even though clearly institutional exhibitions in socialist Poland and Czechoslovakia were a tool of propaganda, cultural policy, and they were controlled by the state, the topic and the content was often proposed by art professionals working for state institutions, and was a response to debates taking place among art historians, critics, and artists at the time. The broad debate was about the right accepted roots of modern art, because depending on what kind of art was seen as the right source of contemporary art, it could legitimize or discard different new artistic tendencies. For example, in the period of socialist realism, modernists were criticized for being formalists, as they were called, and exhibitions of 19th century realism were supposed to provide arguments for or against certain qualities of contemporary art. As Dagmar Swatoszewa writes in the book Wystawa jako medium, published here at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, exhibitions are a medium of presentation, legitimization, communication, and distribution of art. And in my research, it is visible that the exhibitions were used for legitimizing certain artistic tendencies, but not only the tendencies on display, but also the ones emerging from them. The exhibitions which I am focusing on today, reliefs by Henryk Stażewski, or reliefs in Polish, it was an effect of the official cooperation program between Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, so Museum of Art in Łódź, and the National Gallery in Prague. The choice of the artist is interesting for an official representative exhibition in the Eastern Bloc because Stażewski was a pioneer of interwar avant-garde. He worked with geometric abstraction, cooperated with other artists interested in constructivism and neoplasticism like Władysław Strzemiński and Katarzyna Kobro. Stażewski also knew Kazimierz Malewicz, who was from an ethnic Polish family and who visited Warsaw in 1927 and organized his exhibition there at Hotel Polonia. At the time in 1970, at the time of the exhibition of Stażewski's art in Prague, many artists and critics in Czechoslovakia were interested in Malevich, in constructivism, and in geometric abstraction. For instance, the Czech artist and writer Jiří traveled to Poland to see art by Strzemiński and Stażewski, and then he recalled that it was a great opportunity to see artworks made by friends of Malevich. The Czech critic and theoretician Jiří Petra wrote a book about Malevich and suprematism, and Miroslav Lamach, the editor of the art magazine Vytvarné umění, Fine Arts, also promoted Malevich and the Russian avant-garde. In fact, in 1969, the Czech art magazine Vytvarné umění published an article about Strzemiński, written by the Polish art historian Andrzej Turowski, and fragments of Strzemiński's theoretical texts. And in 1970, the magazine published an article about Stażewski, written by the Polish art historian Anka Ptaszkowska. Stażewski was not only an important figure because he was a friend of Malevich or because he was involved in the interwar avant-garde. After World War II, Stażewski remained active and remained an important figure for the avant-garde circles of the younger generation, becoming involved in the Club of Young Artists and Scientists, Krzywe Koło Gallery, or Galeria Foksal. In the early 1950s, he in fact had a brief socialist realist episode, as you can see on the slide, and he painted a few pictures in this aesthetics, but he was generally continuing to develop art rooted in geometric abstraction. In the mid-1950s, Stażewski came up with reliefs, spatial barrel-like elements which tackle issues like movement and relative kinetism. Here on the right, you can see an example of a relief which was presented at the exhibition The Other Transatlantic at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw a few years ago. And here some more examples. So the matters that he was interested in was movement, relative kinetism, matters of proportion, construction, repetition, order and disorder and chance, and also the relation of nature and art, and relations between different colors. These issues were important not only for constructivism, but for the upcoming optical and kinetic art. To the Czech art critics, he represented an avant-garde bridge between artistic generations, as written in one of the reviews of the show in Prague, because, as I said, they were looking at ways to connect the interwar avant-garde and the current avant-garde to overcome the rupture of socialist realism. In Poland, the political thaw started in 1956, sooner than in Czechoslovakia. So in the late 1950s or the second half of the 1950s, in Poland there was relatively more freedom in the institutional art scene. And Czech artists, art critics were looking at what was going on in Poland in order to see also what could be done in Czechoslovakia. For instance, in Poland in 1957, at Warsaw's Central Bureau of Artistic Exhibitions, so the main institution exhibiting contemporary art, there was an exhibition of artworks by Władysław Strzemiński and Katarzyna Kobro. This show put their avant-garde abstract art on the map of institutional art and confirmed and reaffirmed the position and role of their art in the history of Polish art. This brought abstraction and avant-garde to mass culture in post-war Poland to be seen by the new generation of artists and by broader audiences, as Iwona Luba pointed out in her book about these exhibitions. And here on the slide I have selected some images of artworks that were also reproduced in the catalogue. So these are the ones that were involved in the exhibition. Also in 1965, the Central Bureau of Artistic Exhibitions prepared an exhibition of works by Henryk Stażewski. But still, he presented his reliefs, for example, at Galeria Foksal. So here we have an example of how the official and unofficial circulations of art, or at least the official institutional, like state institutional art scene and the avant-garde galleries, how the program merge and how we, with this example, cannot distinguish one from another. In fact, In the photo on the right, you can see the director of Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, Ryszard Stanisławski. He is the one wearing sunglasses. Stanisławski arranged an exhibition of Stażewski's reliefs at the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź in 1969. So in such a time and atmosphere, it was possible for the National Gallery in Prague and the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź to establish official cooperation supported by the ministries of culture of both countries, but directed, led by art professionals who were interested in avant-garde. The initiative was born out of personal contacts between two art historians, Stanisławski, the director of Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, and Jiří Kotalík, the director of National Gallery in Prague. They knew each other, for example, from the international ICA congresses, so the congresses of art critics. Stanisławski became the director of Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź in 1966, and one of his key objectives as the institution's new leader was to establish international contacts for a museum and to promote Polish art abroad. In 1967, Stanisławski visited Prague. He was invited by the Czechoslovak Ministry of Culture and Information and by the National Gallery in Prague. Stanisławski then met with Kotalík and with other representatives of the gallery, and together they developed a plan for cooperation between their institutions. This plan functioned within the framework of the official Polish-Czechoslovak cooperation agreement and was supported by the ministries of culture of both countries. It included an exchange of exhibitions, museum professionals, publications, as well as the exchange and mutual support in acquisitions of artworks between the countries in question. The cooperation was supposed to begin with an exhibition of collages and photographs by the Czech surrealist Henryk Stażewski. The artworks were scheduled to arrive in Łódź on August 25, 1968, so that the exhibition could start on September 10th. Yet the artworks did not arrive, because on the night between 20 and 21st of August, the Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia in order to suppress the Prague Spring. After a brief silence, on September 2nd, Muzeum Sztuki received a telegram from the National Gallery in Prague stating that, given the circumstances, the exhibition could not take place. The invitations were already printed, but Stanisławski asked the employees not to send them out. And I am reading this from archival materials because I thought it's interesting that we can directly trace the dynamic of how the political situation was changing and how it affected the cooperation. And what came afterwards in Czechoslovakia was a period of the so-called normalization. The Prague Spring reforms were suppressed, and the country entered a time of control and repression. This tightening of control and isolation happened somewhat gradually, and in January 1969, Kotalík declared in a letter that after the, quote, unexpected and unfortunate events, the National Gallery was still willing to continue the cooperation, end quote. As a result, in the spring of 1969, the Stażewski exhibition finally took place in Łódź. And then in May 1970, the National Gallery in Prague hosted a presentation of reliefs by Stażewski, which I can come back to here. Yet when the exhibition was on view, the political circumstances were already different from when it was being planned. Both museums tried to continue the exchange, and in the summer of 1971, there was an exhibition of sculptures by the Czech cubist Otto Gutfreund, and next year, Muzeum Sztuki sent an exposition of prints and drawings by the Polish artist Tadeusz Kulisiewicz to Prague. Stanisławski requested that the exchange be continued, but in December 1973, the National Gallery in Prague stated that they would not be able to send more exhibitions to Łódź, at least as it was planned, and it was because of the political situation. It was getting more difficult. And since then, though the cooperation program still existed, it was not as intensive, and the exhibition exchange did not continue as it was planned. The case study of the exhibition of Stażewski's reliefs in Czechoslovakia shows one of the instances when avant-garde art entered the representative state art institutions and was part of the official exchange program. Yet I am not trying to use it as an argument for the avant-garde character of the official circulation of art, because the content was varied, and it's not a rule that abstraction was present. It was maybe rather an exception. Rather, I would think that about this exhibition as a reminder that the institutional circulation of art in the Eastern Bloc is also an important part of exhibition histories, especially when we want to discuss the process of legitimization of different artistic traditions, which led to the approval of or rejection of certain tendencies happening in contemporary art. For instance, another institutional exhibition that took place in Prague in 1970 was the exhibition of so-called Young Poland, so Polish Art Nouveau from the turn of the 20th century. And at first, it might seem unrelated to the exhibition of Stażewski's art, that almost at the same time there was an exhibition of the reliefs by Stażewski and Art Nouveau. But as Milena Bartlova writes in her book dedicated to the history of Czech art history, in the 1960s, Czech art historians and theoreticians were interested in secession in Art Nouveau because this art provided an argument about using expressive lines, using bright colors, and about freeing the form from purely descriptive function. So again, it was about legitimization of certain contemporary artistic choices. Looking at the institutional exhibition history through the debates which were taking place at the time offers an insight into the process of negotiating and building the history of modern art in the Eastern Bloc, and into the efforts of artists, theoreticians, art historians who tried to overcome ruptures caused by shift in political history. Thank you.